The anti-slavery movement marked an important turning point in human rights history. The use of international laws to promote human rights became most prominent with the movement to ban the international slave trade in the 18th and 19th century. Abolitionists, inspired by both Enlightenment ideas of natural rights and by religious beliefs, pushed their governments to make the suppression of the slave trade a focus of international diplomacy and treaty making. The result was that over the first few decades of the 19th century, several international treaties prohibiting the slave trade were signed. These anti-slavery treaties and the global abolitionist movement that prompted them foreshadowed modern international human rights laws and activism. In this class, we will examine the impacts of the anti-slavery movement on the development of human rights doctrine. All slave systems dehumanize enslaved victims and deny them the rights and liberties enjoyed by other members of society. From Greco-Roman slavery to indigenous forms of slavery, all slave systems are founded on inequality, oppression, and exclusion. However, the Atlantic slave trade and chattel slavery in the Americas was exceptional in terms of the extent of brutalization and dehumanization to which captives were subjected. In his famous 1789 autobiography, depicting the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, Olaudah Equiano, himself an enslaved person, invoked human rights. Describing his tortuous journey of captivity from the West African hinterland to the coast, he referred to his captors as sable destroyers of human rights. Equiano went on to describe the horrendous conditions that African captives endured during their journey through the Middle Passage and upon arrival in the New World. Apart from the psychological trauma inflicted during the process of capture and sale, many captives died because of the conditions in overcrowded slave ships through diseases, physical injuries, and suicides. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved persons were subject to a life of servitude and social debt. The uniquely racialized character of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery in general imposed strict barriers on social integration, making race an inflexible marker of status, exclusion, and inequality. In short, every stage of the slave trade was characterized by what would today be termed gross and systematic violations of human rights. The violent, dehumanizing, and oppressive conditions to which enslaved Africans were subjected provided the impetus for the anti-slavery movement. Long before European humanitarians and abolitionists took up the cause of anti-slavery, enslaved Africans, acting individually and collectively, opposed and resisted their enslavement. Resistance to capture and deportation was an integral part of indigenous anti-slavery. Resistance mechanisms took the form of slave flight and rebellion to attacks on slave ships and sabotage of slave-holding forts. Such resistance to enslavement and exploitation in the Americas challenged the institutional foundation of slavery and was crucial to the system's eventual demise. One of such revolts is the rebellion by enslaved Africans resulting in the Haitian Revolution of 1791. Another is the Amistad Revolt of 1839, when enslaved Africans being transported to plantations in Cuba took control of the ship, killing some of the crew and ordering the survivors to sail the ship back to Africa. 19th century anti-slavery campaigns sought to end the violations and indignities of slavery. Abolitionist campaigners aimed at broadening the concept of individual rights to include enslaved persons and providing new international legal frameworks for their protection. Abolitionism drew on the radical philosophies of 18th century Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, the natural rights of man, and the inherent values of liberty in society. The anti-slavery movement and the abolitionist movement was the story of human rights struggles led by transnational activists who took on the powerful interests of states, church, and big commerce. With organization, enthusiasm, and imaginative campaigning, abolitionists mobilized public opinion in opposition to slavery and forced governments to uphold the rights and humanity of enslaved persons. Like the modern human rights movement, the anti-slavery campaigns of the 19th century were broad-based social movements founded on public and popular support. Abolitionist leaders set up transnational coalitions and organized public campaigns appealing to the empathy of their audiences in ways that resemble modern human rights activist and advocacy techniques. Protecting the rights of enslaved persons was the primary goal of the anti-slavery movement. Let us now consider some examples of the organizations involved in the anti-slavery movement and how they used the language of rights in their campaigns. One such organization was the British Anti-Slavery Society. The objective of this organization was the universal abolition of slavery and watching over the rights of all persons captured as slaves. Another such organization was the American Anti-Slavery Society, which published a monthly journal in the 1830s entitled Human Rights. These abolitionists were pioneers in developing the modern concept of human rights. In making the connection between anti-slavery and human rights, it is necessary to make the distinction between abolitionism, the immediate process of ending slavery, and emancipation, the longer process by which those enslaved became formally free. While the act of abolition was largely state-sponsored, through legislative enactments arising from activist campaigns and public pressure, the process of emancipation involved a combination of social, political, economic, and cultural forces. Motivated by religious beliefs and Enlightenment conceptions of natural rights, these abolitionists in Europe pushed their governments to sign international treaties to suppress the slave trade. These treaties resulted in the establishment of what have been described as the world's first international human rights courts, the Admiralty Tribunals, and the Courts of Mixed Commissions. These courts were empowered to confiscate slave ships engaged in the illegal slave trade and liberate the slaves found on board. The conception of the slave trade as a crime against humanity and of slave traders as hostis humanis generis, which means enemies of mankind, helped lay the foundation for 20th century international human rights law. Legal action against the slave trade introduced into modern international legal discourse the idea that violations of human rights were offenses of concern to humankind generally, not just people and their sovereign. The role of anti-slavery in shaping transnational debates on ethics and morality in the 19th century was far-reaching. With the emergence of anti-slavery campaigns, something new and permanent developed that represented a significant break from the old political morality. Anti-slavery did not guarantee freedom for everyone, and sometimes even created new orthodoxies that took on elements of older oppressive structures. However, the achievement of the 19th century anti-slavery movement is that it provided new opportunities to former slaves and captives or those most at risk to escape from old structural constraints. Humanitarians and evangelicals at the forefront of the transnational anti-slavery movement promoted universal humanism in both thought and activism. Within the humanist framework, anti-slavery became a universal movement of rights representing a new social radicalism that challenged the structure of profit, domination, and advantage that had sustained slavery. Abolitionists in Europe and across the Atlantic employed a language of ethics and rights to articulate their opposition to slavery, which is most evident in missionary literature. The British politician and philanthropist William Wilberforce was one of the leaders of the movement to abolish the slave trade. Following a religious conversion experience, he became an evangelical Christian and joined with other anti-slave trade activists such as Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp to lead a parliamentary campaign against the British slave trade. This led to the eventual passage of the Slave Trade Act in Britain in 1807. Slavery was eventually outlawed throughout the British Empire, including Canada, in 1833. At the Vienna Congress of 1814, 8 European powers signed the Declaration on the Universal Abolition of the Slave Trade. The declaration proclaimed the slave trade to be repugnant to the principles of humanity and universal morality. It pledged the signatory nations to work towards the abolition of the slave trade. In the Americas, humanitarian and religious activists such as the Quakers campaigned for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. The Anti-Slavery Society framed its opposition to slavery in terms of a common humanity, invoking empathy, public morality, and Christian ethics. The central premise of its campaign was that the notion of slavery is morally abhorrent and that those enslaved were entitled to certain fundamental rights and liberties. The seal of the Anti-Slavery Society, which symbolized the humanistic framing of anti-slavery, was an image of a supplicant slave in chains along with the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Anti-slavery groups deployed advocacy techniques such as petition campaigns, economic boycotts, and lobbying political leaders for change. They also built networks around advocacy forums such as the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention, which provided the legal and activist framework for abolitionism. However, it is important to note that not everyone supported the movement to end the slave trade. Abolitionists had to respond constantly to forthright defenders of slavery who upheld the institution on the grounds of economic efficiency, social convention, custom, and race. Opposition to abolition came from slaveholders and from political and mercantile elites concerned about economic losses and disruptions to the existing social and political order. Contradictions between the interests of individuals, families, social communities, and organizations also played an important part in prolonging the slave trade, even as people fought against it. Yet, by the early 20th century, slavery had been formally abolished in most parts of the world through a series of international treaties and legal enforcement mechanisms. Although the anti-slavery campaigns of the 19th century were not always explicitly framed in terms of human rights, notions of human dignity, a common humanity, and individual liberties featured prominently in anti-slavery discourses. Abolitionists articulated anti-slavery through the language of Christian morality and the inherent rights and dignity of enslaved persons. Even though slavery was abolished in the 19th century, forms of so-called modern-day slavery persist around the world. Human rights activists working to end modern-day slavery argue that slavery continues even till this day in new forms of servitude such as forced labor, debt bondage, human trafficking, child slavery, and forced marriages. So in some ways, the movement to end all forms of slavery remains an ongoing global task.